Colombia, 2008. Part 1. A Life Forever Changed. The vibrant city of Bogotá pulsed with life. Horns honked, vendors shouted their wares, and the unmistakable hum of city life filled the air. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Amidst the chaos of the busy streets, Sofia Muñoz sat in the back seat of her friend's car, her heart light and her laughter echoing in the vehicle. At 17, Sofia had the world at her feet. She was days away from beginning her dream at one of Colombia's top law schools. Every step of her life had led her to this moment. Her acceptance into the university's prestigious law program. It was more than a personal victory. It was the culmination of years of hard work, the realization of a dream that she had nurtured for as long as she could remember. Her parents, Marisol and Jorge, had raised her in a close-knit family, always encouraging her to strive for excellence. They had instilled in her a sense of purpose and faith, and now, watching their daughter succeed brought them immense pride. Sofia, with her warm brown eyes and infectious energy, was a force to be reckoned with. Her friends admired her, and her family adored her. That evening, Sofia had spent hours with her friends, celebrating the beginning of this new chapter in her life. They laughed, shared stories about the future, and spoke about their dreams with the carefree spirit only youth possesses. As the car cruised through the streets of Bogotá, there was no hint of what was about to unfold. Sofia leaned her head against the window, her mind wandering to the future, her future. She envisioned herself in courtrooms, advocating for justice, defending the vulnerable, and making a difference in the world. Her dreams felt so close she could almost touch them. But life, in all its unpredictability, had different plans. The sound of screeching tires shattered the peaceful moment. In an instant, everything changed. A truck, barreling through a red light at full speed, collided with their car. The impact was violent. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and the force of the collision sent the vehicle spinning out of control. Sofia's world erupted into chaos. The screams of her friends mixed with the deafening noise of the crash, and in those harrowing seconds, everything went dark. When Sofia awoke, the world she had known was gone. She was no longer in the car, surrounded by her friends. Instead, she was lying in a sterile hospital bed, the scent of antiseptic filling her nostrils, and the rhythmic beeping of machines the only sound breaking the eerie silence. The brightness of the fluorescent lights overhead made her squint as she tried to piece together what had happened. Her body felt heavy, disconnected from her mind. She tried to move, but her legs wouldn't respond. Panic surged through her veins as she frantically looked around the room. Her mother, Marisol, was sitting at the foot of the bed, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Her father, Jorge, stood motionless by the door, gripping a rosary so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The sight of their grief struck Sofia harder than any physical pain she was feeling. She tried to speak, her throat dry and raspy, but her voice barely made it out. "What happened?" she croaked, though deep down a part of her already knew the answer. Her mother rushed to her side, taking Sofia's hand in hers. The warmth of her mother's touch was comforting, but the look in Marisol's eyes was anything but. The doctors arrived soon after, their expressions somber, their words cautious. "You were in a car accident," one of them began, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of bad news. "You've suffered significant spinal cord damage, Sofia. I'm so sorry, but you won't be able to walk again." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. She wanted to scream, to argue, to demand that this wasn't real, that this couldn't be happening to her. Her body refused to cooperate, but her mind raced. How could this be? Just hours ago, she had been dreaming of her future, and now, in the blink of an eye, that future had been ripped away from her. Her legs, which had carried her through life, were now useless. The doctors' voices faded into the background as her world crumbled around her. She barely registered their explanations of surgeries and therapies, of the life she would now have to adapt to. Sophia felt numb. The disbelief was overwhelming. She could feel the sting of tears behind her eyes, but they wouldn't fall. All she could do was stare at the ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts, her heart shattered. The days that followed were a blur of hospital beds, physical examinations, and the overwhelming presence of her parents, who refused to leave her side. Sophia remained quiet, trapped in her own despair. She couldn't bring herself to face the reality of what her life had become. Her body no longer felt like her own. She couldn't feel her legs, but the emotional pain was unbearable. Marisol prayed constantly, her rosary beads clutched tightly in her hands, her whispered prayers filling the silence of Sophia's hospital room. Jorge, always the stoic one, sat quietly in the corner, his faith unshaken, even as his daughter lay broken before him. They clung to their beliefs, trusting that God had a plan, that there was some greater purpose behind this tragedy. But Sophia couldn't share in their hope. She had always believed in God, but now she felt abandoned, forsaken. Where was God in her darkest moment? Why had he allowed this to happen? Each time her parents would speak of miracles or healing, Sophia would tune them out. Their faith, once a source of comfort, now felt like salt in a wound. She didn't want to hear about God's plan, or that this was all part of some divine test. What kind of God would allow this? Her bitterness grew with each passing day. The vibrant, ambitious girl she had been was slipping away, replaced by someone angry and broken. Her friends came to visit, their faces filled with sympathy, but it only deepened Sophia's sense of loss. They would return to their lives, university, parties, freedom, while she remained trapped in this broken body. Their well-meaning words of encouragement fell on deaf ears. How could they possibly understand what she was going through? Sophia's dreams, the ones that had once filled her with excitement and purpose, now felt like cruel reminders of everything she had lost. The acceptance letter to law school, which had once been her greatest achievement, was now just a piece of paper mocking her from the corner of her hospital room. She would never walk into a courtroom, never stand before a judge or defend the innocent. Her future, so carefully crafted, had crumbled before her eyes. The doctors, though kind, offered little hope. They explained the severity of her injury again and again, trying to prepare her for the life ahead. A life confined to a wheelchair. They spoke of physical therapy, of learning to adapt, but Sophia couldn't bring herself to care. Her body may have survived the crash, but her spirit had been shattered beyond repair. The weight of it all was crushing. Each morning, Sophia woke up, hoping it had all been a nightmare, only to be greeted by the cold reality of her situation. She would glance down at her legs, willing them to move, praying for even the slightest twitch, but there was nothing. They were unresponsive, lifeless. Her faith, once strong and unwavering, had been broken. Where was God now? Part 2. A prison without bars. The soft glow of morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a golden hue over Sophia's bedroom, a place that once felt like her sanctuary. The room was exactly how she had left it before the accident. Colorful posters adorned the walls, books lined the shelves, and her university acceptance letter sat proudly on the desk. But now, this room, once a symbol of her bright future, felt like a prison. A prison without bars, but one that confined her all the same. Her bed, where she now spent most of her days, had become the epicenter of her life. The wheelchair sat ominously beside it, a constant reminder of her new reality. Sophia lay still, staring up at the ceiling, her body aching not from pain, but from the sheer weight of her circumstances. Weeks had passed since she had returned home, but the routine was always the same. She woke up, tried to move her legs, and when they refused to obey, she sank deeper into despair. Her mother, Marisol, was the first to enter the room every morning. Today was no different. Marisol tiptoed in with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, holding a tray of breakfast, fresh arepas and fruit, Sophia's favorite. But the smell of food that once made her stomach growl now only made her feel sick. The sight of her mother, tirelessly trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, only deepened the pit in her stomach. "Buenos dias, mi amor," Marisol greeted softly, setting the tray down on the bedside table. Her voice was filled with forced cheerfulness, as if her tone alone could will Sophia into believing that everything was going to be all right. But Sophia couldn't bring herself to respond. Instead, she turned her head away, closing her eyes as if to block out the world. Marisol's face fell slightly, but she didn't push. She never did. She was patient, always trying to be strong for her daughter. But Sophia could see through the facade. The tears her mother tried to hide were becoming more frequent. The prayers that had once been whispers at her bedside were now desperate cries to God, asking for strength, asking for healing. Marisol had always been the rock of their family, unshakable in her faith, unwavering in her belief that God had a plan. But Sophia could see the cracks forming. Her mother's eyes, once bright and full of hope, now held a sadness that Sophia couldn't bear to look at. It was as if Marisol's heart was breaking a little more each day, right alongside her daughter's. Jorge, her father, was quieter than ever. He was never one to speak much, but now his silences felt heavier. Sophia often caught him standing in the doorway, watching her with a mixture of sorrow and helplessness, as if he were looking at a version of his daughter that no longer existed. He would leave for work before sunrise and come home late at night, avoiding the tension in the house. Sophia knew he couldn't handle seeing her like this. In his mind, he was the protector, the provider. But now, there was nothing he could do to fix what had happened. The days blended together. Sophia's life, once vibrant and full of motion, had slowed to a crawl. Every morning, she awoke to the same unchanging reality. Her friends had returned to their lives, moving on as life required, but Sophia remained stuck, suspended in time. They would occasionally visit, sitting on the edge of her bed, their voices filled with awkward cheer as they recounted stories of university life. They spoke of things that once excited her, new classes, parties, their growing independence. But now it felt like they were describing a world that she no longer belonged to. At first, Sophia tried to maintain the facade, nodding along and forcing a smile as they spoke. But it wasn't long before their visits began to grate on her. She no longer wanted to hear about the world outside, a world that was moving forward while she remained trapped in the past. She resented their freedom, their ability to walk out of her room and return to their lives, while she was confined to this room, this body that no longer felt like her own. One by one, her friends stopped coming as often. The cheerful messages on her phone slowed, the invitations to events ceased altogether. Sophia couldn't blame them. How could she expect them to keep visiting, to keep pretending everything was fine? She had become a ghost of her former self, and it wasn't fair to ask them to stick around for that. Mornings were the hardest. The first few seconds after waking up, there was always a moment when she forgot. In those brief, precious seconds, everything felt normal, until she tried to move. The crushing weight of reality would hit her all over again, and she would feel the familiar wave of despair wash over her. It wasn't just the physical limitations. It was the loss of everything she had worked so hard for. Her dreams of becoming a lawyer, of standing in a courtroom, of making a difference. Those dreams felt like distant memories now, taunting her from a past life. Her room had become a monument to the life she had lost. The university brochures, once carefully organized on her desk, were now gathering dust. The books on law that she had devoured in preparation for her future sat untouched, mocking her with their presence. Even the clothes in her closet, the ones she had carefully picked out for her first day of classes, hung there as a cruel reminder of the life she would never have. There were moments, fleeting moments, when Sophia allowed herself to imagine a future. But those thoughts were always accompanied by an overwhelming sense of guilt. How could she think about the future when her present was so broken? She felt trapped in a cycle of hopelessness, unable to break free from the overwhelming sense of loss that consumed her. Her parents continued to pray, their faith as unyielding as ever. They attended church regularly, lighting candles for Sophia, asking the congregation to keep her in their prayers. Marisol often brought holy water to sprinkle on Sophia's legs, muttering prayers under her breath. her eyes filled with a desperate hope that Sophia no longer shared. Sophia's bitterness grew. She could see the pain her parents were in, but she couldn't bring herself to comfort them. How could she, when she couldn't even find comfort for herself? The God she had once believed in, the God her parents still clung to, felt distant and indifferent. What kind of God would allow this? What kind of God would take away her ability to walk, to live? It wasn't just her body that had been paralyzed. Her faith, too, had become numb. Sophia had always believed in God, had grown up going to church with her family, had prayed faithfully. But now, her prayers felt hollow, like they were disappearing into a void. She no longer had the strength to believe in miracles. The girl who had once stood at the threshold of a bright future now felt like she was standing on the edge of an abyss. As the days turned into weeks, Sophia withdrew further into herself. She spoke less, even to her parents, and spent more time staring out the window, watching the world go by without her. She could hear the sounds of life outside, the laughter of children playing, the distant hum of traffic, the call of street vendors. But it all felt so far away, as if she were watching it through a thick pane of glass. Her room, once filled with the warmth of her laughter and the dreams of a promising future, was now silent, save for the quiet whispers of her mother's prayers. But Sophia couldn't bear to join in those prayers anymore. She had prayed, begged, pleaded with God to heal her, to restore her legs, to give her back her life. But there had been no answer, no miracle, only silence. And in that silence, Sophia felt herself slipping away. Part 3. A glimmer in the darkness. The air was thick with humidity as Sophia's parents helped her into the car. The evening was still, but inside Sophia's mind, there was a storm brewing. They had been speaking of this healing service for weeks now, a gathering in a small church at the edge of the city where miracles were said to happen. People were talking about it everywhere, how the sick were being healed, how lives were being changed. But Sophia didn't care about miracles anymore. She had stopped believing in them long ago. Her mother, Miraculous, had pleaded with her, practically begging her to attend. Sophia had resisted at first, growing tired of the constant prayers and hopeful looks. But something in her mother's eyes, the desperation, the unshakable belief that maybe, just maybe, this could change things, had made her relent. So here she was, sitting in the back seat of the car, her wheelchair folded beside her, feeling the familiar weight of her broken dreams pressing down on her. As the car drove through the quiet streets of Bogota, Sophia stared out the window, her thoughts a mix of resentment and exhaustion. The world outside seemed so normal, people going about their lives without a care. But Sophia's world had been flipped upside down. She no longer felt like part of it, no longer felt like herself. Her reflection in the window showed a girl who had once been full of hope and promise. But now, she barely recognized herself. When they arrived at the church, the sight that greeted Sophia was overwhelming. People filled the small courtyard, spilling out onto the streets, their voices rising in fervent prayer and song. The energy in the air was palpable, an almost electric sense of anticipation. It was as if the people here were waiting for something extraordinary to happen. And for the first time in a long while, Sophia felt a flicker of curiosity, though she quickly smothered it. Her father, Jorge, helped lift her out of the car and into her wheelchair. His strong hands gripped the handles as he guided her through the crowd, his face set with determination. Sophia felt like an outsider in this sea of faith. People smiled at her, some even offering words of encouragement, but it only deepened her sense of isolation. She didn't want their pity. She didn't want to be seen as a project in need of saving. Inside the church, the atmosphere was even more intense. The air was thick with the scent of incense and candles, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the wooden pews. A soft murmur of prayer filled the space, and the walls seemed to vibrate with the energy of the gathering crowd. The altar was simple, adorned with a single cross, but it seemed to glow under the dim lights, as if it held the weight of all the hope in the room. Sophia was positioned near the back, her wheelchair blending into the shadows as the service began. The pastor, a middle-aged man with a gentle face and deep, resonant voice spoke of miracles, of God's healing power, of the blind seeing and the lame walking. His words echoed off the walls, filling the space with a sense of awe. People around her were already weeping, their hands lifted to the heavens, crying out to God for deliverance from their pain. Sophia felt nothing. She wanted to believe, she really did, but something inside her had hardened. It was as though all the prayers, all the hopes for healing, had formed a wall around her heart, a wall that nothing, not even the most fervent of faiths, could break through. She watched the service unfold before her as if from a distance, disconnected from the joy and sorrow that filled the room. Her mother knelt beside her, hands clasped tightly in prayer, her lips moving silently as she begged God to intervene. Sophia's father stood behind them, his face etched with the quiet determination that had always defined him. They were fighting so hard to hold on to hope, but Sophia had no fight left in her. The pastor continued to speak, his voice rising with conviction. God has not forgotten you, he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. He knows your pain. He knows your struggle. And he is here, right now, to meet you where you are. Sophia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her legs, numb and useless, tingled slightly, but it was nothing more than a phantom sensation. She had felt it before. Those fleeting moments of imagined movement that were quickly crushed by the reality of her paralysis. Then, something strange happened. The pastor's gaze fell on her. His eyes, dark and intense, seemed to pierce through the crowd, locking onto her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. You, he said, pointing in her direction, his voice steady but filled with authority. God has not forgotten you. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She felt the eyes of the congregation turn toward her, but she didn't want their attention. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the shadows and escape the weight of their expectations. But the pastor didn't look away. He stepped down from the altar and began walking toward her, his presence commanding the attention of the entire room. Her heart pounded in her chest as he knelt beside her wheelchair. She wanted to push him away, to tell him that he was wasting his time. But before she could say anything, he gently took her hand in his and began to pray. His words were soft but powerful, each one resonating deep within her. In the name of Jesus, he said, I speak healing over you. I declare that you will walk again. The room was silent, save for the sound of the pastor's prayer. Sophia could feel the heat from his hand as it rested on her legs that had been cold and lifeless for so long. She wanted to pull away, to tell him to stop, but something held her in place. The warmth began to spread, slowly at first, then growing more intense. It started in her thighs, then moved down to her knees, and finally to her feet. It was a strange, almost unbearable sensation, as if her legs were waking up from a long sleep. Her breath quickened as the heat intensified, and she felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there, flickering like a candle in the darkness. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to give in to the possibility that this could be real. But the warmth continued to spread, and with it came a sensation she had long forgotten, feeling. Sophia's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. She had heard the doctors. She knew what they had said, but the heat in her legs was undeniable. And for the first time since the accident, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, something extraordinary was happening. The pastor's voice softened as he finished his prayer. Now, he said, his eyes meeting hers once more. Stand and walk. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at him, disbelief warring with a tiny flicker of hope inside her. Her hands trembled as she gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, her mind screaming that it was impossible, that she shouldn't even try. But the warmth in her legs persisted, and with it came a growing sense of strength. Try, the pastor urged softly, his voice filled with compassion. Just try. Sophia took a deep breath, her heart racing as she slowly shifted her weight forward. Every instinct in her body told her to stop, that she was setting herself up for disappointment. But something, whether it was the heat in her legs or the quiet voice in her heart, pushed her to keep going. Her hands tightened around the armrests as she pushed herself upward. The congregation watched in silence, their collective breath held as Sophia did the unthinkable. For the first time in months, her feet touched the ground and she could feel it. Part 4. The miracle unfolds. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The warmth in her legs had grown into something impossible to ignore, a sensation that wasn't just a fleeting hope but something real, tangible. She gripped the armrests of her wheelchair so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her heart hammering in her chest. The room seemed to close in around her, the faces of the congregation a blur of disbelief, awe, and anticipation. "Stand and walk," the pastor repeated softly, his eyes still fixed on her, unwavering. His words were a command, but they were filled with such gentle certainty that it made her want to believe. Her legs felt like they were on fire, but it wasn't pain, it was life, something that hadn't existed in them since the accident. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her, the tension in the air so thick it was suffocating. This was it, the moment they had all prayed for, the moment her parents had waited for. But what if it didn't work? What if she tried to stand and her legs failed her, crumbling under her like before? The fear was overwhelming, but so was the sudden, overwhelming sense of possibility. Her mother, kneeling beside her, whispered under her breath, her prayers fast and desperate. "Please, God, please." Marisol's hands clutched her rosary, her tear-streaked face lifted toward the heavens, eyes closed as if willing her daughter's legs to move. Sophia's father, Jorge, stood behind her, his hands trembling, but his gaze never left his daughter. He believed he always had. His silence was a strength, and in that moment, Sophia drew on that strength. She closed her eyes for just a second, letting the sound of the pastor's voice and her parents' prayers wash over her. The heat in her legs surged, and then she moved. It was subtle at first, just a small shift, but it was there. Her feet, planted on the ground, felt the pressure. The sensation shot up her spine like a current of energy, and suddenly, Sophia realized that her legs could hold her. It wasn't easy. Her muscles, weakened from months of disuse, trembled under the effort. Her arms wobbled as they pushed her upward, and her breath came in quick, shallow bursts. She felt like she was balancing on the edge of something monumental, something that could change everything or send her crashing back into despair. The silence in the room was deafening. Every person in that small, crowded church was holding their breath, eyes wide and hearts pounding as they watched Sophia rise from her wheelchair. For what seemed like an eternity, nothing else existed. No sound, no movement, just the weight of the moment. Then she stood. The world seemed to tilt as Sophia's feet bore her weight fully for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Her legs wobbled uncertain, but they held. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and then the church exploded into life. People rose to their feet, tears streaming down their faces as they shouted praises, their hands lifted high in worship and gratitude. The sound was overwhelming, loud, joyful, chaotic. But through it all, Sophia could only hear the thudding of her own heartbeat and the soft, steady breathing of her mother beside her. Sophia's legs shook with the effort, but she didn't collapse. She didn't fall. She stood, and for the first time in months, she felt alive again. A sob escaped her lips before she could stop it, and then the tears came. They fell freely, without restraint, as months of anger, pain, and hopelessness seemed to pour out of her all at once. Her mother, overwhelmed with emotion, threw her arms around Sophia, holding her tightly as if she never wanted to let go. "Gracias, Dios. Gracias," she whispered over and over, her voice shaking with disbelief and gratitude. Jorge, too, finally broke his silence, his stoic demeanor cracking as tears spilled down his face. He stepped forward, wrapping both his wife and daughter in his arms, his head bowed as he silently gave thanks for the miracle unfolding before his eyes. Sophia's knees buckled slightly under the weight of her emotions, but she didn't fall. She couldn't fall. Her body, weak as it was, refused to give in. The warmth that had started in her legs had spread through her entire body now, filling her with a sense of strength that she hadn't felt in so long. It was as if every cell in her body had been awakened, reborn. The pastor stood a few feet away, his eyes closed, his hands lifted toward the heavens as he whispered a prayer of thanks. He had seen miracles before, but this felt different. The air in the church was thick with the presence of something divine, something greater than any of them. It was as if heaven itself had touched down in that small, humble space. Sophia took a deep, shaky breath and, with her mother still clinging to her, took a step. It was small, tentative, but it was a step. Her foot connected with the ground, and she felt the solidness of it beneath her. She took another step, and then another. Her legs were weak, her steps unsteady, but she was walking. For the first time since the accident, Sophia Munoz was walking again. The congregation erupted in celebration. Some fell to their knees in prayer. Others lifted their hands and voices in song, praising God for the miracle they had just witnessed. Sophia could barely comprehend the noise around her, the explosion of joy and awe that filled the room. All she could focus on was the feeling of her feet moving beneath her, the sensation of each step, the overwhelming reality that she was walking. Her father, still holding her tightly, laughed through his tears. He had always believed in miracles, but to see one unfold before his eyes, to see his daughter walking, was more than he had ever dared to hope for. "Me, Nina," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You're walking." Sophia looked up at him, her face wet with tears but filled with a new light, a new hope. "I'm walking," she whispered back, her voice trembling but sure. And in that moment she believed, not just in the power of her body to heal, but in something greater, something divine that had touched her in her darkest hour. As the celebration in the church continued, Sophia took another step and then another. With each step, her confidence grew. Her legs, though weak, moved with a strength that felt like it came from somewhere beyond herself. She wasn't walking alone. She could feel that now. There was something or someone guiding her, lifting her, carrying her forward. The pastor, his eyes still closed in prayer, finally stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder. "You see," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "God never forgot you." Sophia nodded, unable to speak. She didn't have the words to express the overwhelming gratitude, the awe, the sheer joy that filled her heart. All she could do was take another step, and then another, her legs growing stronger with each movement. The miracle had happened. Part 5. Walking toward a new destiny. The morning sunlight bathed the quiet streets of Bogotá, casting long shadows through the windows of Sophia's family home. The familiar scent of fresh arepas filled the kitchen, accompanied by the sounds of Marisol humming softly as she prepared breakfast. But something in the air was different. There was a lightness, a sense of peace that hadn't been there in months. Sophia sat at the kitchen table, her legs stretched out in front of her, her feet resting firmly on the ground. She could feel the coolness of the tile beneath her toes, and every now and then, she would flex her feet, marveling at the sensation. It had been 2 weeks since the night at the church, 2 weeks since she had stood from her wheelchair and taken her first steps toward healing. Every day since then had been a gift, a miracle that continued to unfold in ways she couldn't have imagined. Her body was still weak, her muscles still learning to work again, but every morning she awoke to the steady progress of strength returning. The routine of physical therapy had become a part of her life, but now, it was no longer a burden. It was a joy. Each session was a reminder of what she had overcome, of the divine touch that had restored her ability to walk. Her father, Jorge, entered the kitchen quietly, his face softened by the morning light. He glanced at Sophia, and their eyes met in a shared moment of understanding. He had always believed in miracles, but to witness one so intimately, to see his daughter walk again, was a humbling experience. He crossed the room and placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder, his grip strong and full of love. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. "I'm good," Sophia replied, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Better every day." Jorge nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "I knew you would be." Marisol joined them at the table, setting down a plate of food in front of Sophia. her face glowing with a joy that had been absent for too long. She had spent the last 2 weeks in a constant state of gratitude, her prayers no longer filled with desperation, but with thanks. Every morning, she lit a candle at the small altar in their home, whispering her praise to the heavens for the miracle they had been given. "I made your favorite," Marisol said, her voice soft and filled with affection. "Eat up. You need to keep your strength up." Sophia chuckled softly, taking a bite of the warm arepa. It tasted like home, like comfort, like everything she had been missing. "I'm going to walk outside today," Sophia said between bites, her voice filled with a quiet determination. Her parents exchanged a glance, both of them beaming with pride. It was a small thing, walking outside, but for Sophia, it was monumental. 2 weeks ago, the thought of walking anywhere, let alone outside, had seemed impossible. But now, every step she took was a victory. After breakfast, Sophia stood from the table, her legs still shaky but stronger than the day before. She took slow, careful steps toward the door, her parents following close behind, their eyes watching her every move with a mixture of awe and reverence. The front door opened, and the fresh morning air rushed in, filling the room with the scent of blooming flowers and the promise of a new day. Sophia stepped outside, her feet touching the soft grass of their front yard. The world looked different now, brighter, more alive. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. And for the first time in months, she felt free. The neighbors, who had been quietly watching from a distance, began to gather along the sidewalk, their faces filled with wonder. Word of Sophia's miracle had spread quickly through the neighborhood, and people had been waiting for the day when they would see her walk again. As she moved forward, their soft murmurs of disbelief turned into spontaneous applause, their hands clapping in celebration of the young woman who had defied the odds. Sophia paused for a moment, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of sadness or frustration. They were tears of gratitude. She looked at the faces of the people who had prayed for her, who had believed in her even when she couldn't believe in herself, and she smiled. She took another step, then another, until she was standing in the middle of the street, surrounded by her neighbors, her community. Her parents stood nearby, their hands clasped together, watching their daughter walk with a strength and grace that could only come from something greater than themselves. In that moment, Sophia realized that the miracle she had experienced wasn't just about walking again. It was about being given a second chance, a chance to live, to dream, to hope. Her faith, once shattered and broken, had been restored, not just because her body had healed, but because she had been touched by something divine, something that transcended the physical. She had been given the gift of perspective, of understanding that even in the darkest moments, there was light to be found. The pastor's words echoed in her mind. God never forgot you, and he was right. Even in her deepest despair, when she had felt abandoned and forsaken, God had been there, watching over her, waiting for the right moment to reveal his plan. It wasn't an instant healing. It had taken time, struggle, and pain, but it had happened in the most perfect way, at the most perfect time. As Sophia stood there, surrounded by her family, her friends, and her community, she felt something stir deep within her, a calling, a purpose. She had been given this miracle for a reason, and now it was up to her to share it with others. She would go back to school, yes, but her path was different now. Her desire to become a lawyer had not diminished, but it had been transformed. She wanted to help others find the same hope that had been given to her, to show them that even in the darkest times, there was a light waiting to guide them. She took a final, deep breath, her heart swelling with gratitude, and turned to face her parents. They smiled at her, their eyes filled with love, pride, and the unshakable bond of family that had carried them through this trial. "Let's go for a walk," Sophia said softly, her voice steady and sure. And together, they walked into the future, one step at a time. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.